France, May 1940. A gray dawn presses low over the fields near Arras. The air smells of rain and burnt oil. Mud clings to the boots of British soldiers crouched behind hedgerows, listening for the growl that will soon come, the sound of German Panzer engines. Across the valley, Wehrmacht troops watch through field glasses and laugh at the British tanks. Lumbering forward, look ancient, squat, slow. Their tracks churning the soil like relics of another war. Panzer crews call them teapots on tracks in the distance. A Matilda II struggles to climb the slope, its thick armor glinting dully beneath the morning light. Then the laughter stops. A German 37mm shell slams against the Matilda's hull and ricochets another shot. Another spark, no penetration, the machine keeps advancing. Unflinching British guns answer German positions, erupt. What began as mockery becomes confusion, and then fear. That morning, the myth of German invincibility met something new. A whisper that would soon have a name, Churchill. The First World War had ended in mud and steel on the shattered fields of the Somme and Cambrai. The tank was born, a strange British invention meant to break the stalemate of trenches. It was heavy, unreliable, and terrifying, but it worked for a moment in 1917. The tank symbolized the future of warfare. Then came peace and amnesia. In the interwar years, Britain forgot what it had invented. The 1920s brought economic hardship, political exhaustion, and the illusion that the Great War had been the war to end all wars. Military budgets were slashed, tank factories closed. Young officers who spoke of mechanized war were politely ignored or reassigned Britain. The nation that had pioneered armored warfare now viewed tanks as defensive novelties, tools to assist infantry, not to lead them. Meanwhile, across the Channel, a defeated Germany was quietly learning. The Treaty of Versailles had banned the Reichswehr from developing tanks. But German officers like Heinz Guderian studied them obsessively in secret. They read British theorists, especially J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Littlehart, who had once envisioned fast, mechanized warfare. Ironically, Britain's own ideas became the foundation of German blitzkrieg. By the mid-1930s, when rearmament began, Britain's tank philosophy was divided. Two families emerged: the infantry tank, slow, heavily armored, designed to accompany foot soldiers, and the cruiser tank, fast, lightly armored, meant for breakthroughs. It was a compromise born of limited budgets and differing visions, leaving no single powerful design to rival what Germany was building. Factories like Vickers produced small tanks with machine guns or 2-pounder cannons, adequate for colonial policing but not for modern war tank crews trained on outdated machines, often driving mock-ups made of wood. By 1938, Britain had fewer than 200 serviceable modern tanks, yet the nation still believed its navy and empire would deter any threat from Europe. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler watched Britain's hesitation with amusement. German propaganda portrayed the British Army as a gentleman's relic, brave but technologically backward. When Wehrmacht officers first saw British light tanks in Spain during the Civil War, they laughed openly against German Panzer IS and 3 prototypes. British designs looked fragile, slow, and outdated. Even inside Britain, doubts grew. Winston Churchill, then out of government, warned that the nation was unprepared for modern war. His speeches in Parliament were often dismissed as alarmist. Few listened to the man who, 2 decades earlier, had championed the first tanks at the Admiralty. By 1939, the situation was grim. The British Expeditionary Force, BEF, planned to send its troops to France in case of German aggression. But its armor was a patchwork. The Matilda I, with a single machine gun, was hopelessly obsolete. The Matilda II, though well-armored, was scarce, and slow cruiser tanks offered speed but paper-thin protection. Britain's tank doctrine assumed the enemy would fight defensively, not sweep across Europe with lightning speed. In Germany, the tank had become a symbol of national pride. Panzer divisions trained relentlessly, combining tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and air support under unified command. The result was a new art of war, coordinated, fast, and ruthless. While British generals debated committee definitions, German officers rehearsed annihilation. By the time Britain declared war in September 1939, the imbalance was already clear. Germany fielded over 2,000 operational tanks. Britain could muster barely a few hundred. Worse, few in London understood that the next war would not be fought along the same slow, methodical lines as 1914–18. When British tanks finally rolled into France in late 1939, they carried not just armor and ammunition, but the burden of 2 decades of neglect. And across the enemy lines, the laughter grew louder to German tank crews. These British machines looked like museum pieces crawling to their doom. They would soon discover how wrong that laughter could be. When war officially began in September 1939, Europe did not explode at once for months. Nothing seemed to happen. The newspapers called it the phony war on the Western Front. British and French troops dug in along the Maginot Line while German soldiers waited behind the Siegfried Line. But beneath the calm, both sides were preparing. For Britain, that preparation was confused. The British Expeditionary Force arrived in France under General Lord Gort. It brought courage and professionalism. But its armored force was small, fewer than 300 tanks. Most were light cruisers or early Matildas. Slow and mechanically fragile, they were meant for support. Not for sweeping advances. Tank regiments were scattered among infantry divisions instead of grouped as a striking arm. In contrast, the Wehrmacht had forged its armored power into concentrated divisions. Each panzer unit moved with its own artillery, engineers, and radio-linked command. It was a living organism built for movement. When the storm finally broke in May 1940, the difference became clear in days. German armor surged through the Ardennes, a route Allied planners had thought impassable to tanks. The French front collapsed like wet paper. The BEF stretched thin along the line, tried to resist but was soon forced into chaotic retreat. Towns fell one after another: Sedan, Arras, Calais, Dunkirk. At Arras, British tanks made a rare counterattack. It was there, on May 21st, that the Germans first realized the British had at least one machine worth fearing: the Matilda II. Slow, yes, barely 15 miles per hour, but its thick 78mm armor shrugged off the 37mm anti-tank guns that German infantry carried at Arras. 2 British battalions charged headlong into Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, German. Shells bounced off their hulls like pebbles for a moment. Panic spread among the Germans, and Rommel himself feared encirclement. He later wrote that the attack made a momentary gap in our lines and caused considerable confusion. But the Matildas were too few. They advanced without air cover or coordination. And soon the tide turned. Stukas roared overhead, smashing British columns. Tanks were abandoned, out of fuel or immobilized by hits to their tracks within days. The BEF was pushed to the beaches of Dunkirk. There, under a pall of smoke and German artillery fire, Britain's army escaped, but left nearly all its heavy equipment behind. Over 700 tanks were lost in France. When the survivors returned home, they brought not machines, but bitter lessons. Churchill had become Prime Minister just days before Dunkirk. The nation was humiliated, but unbroken in London as German bombers began their nightly raids. The new Prime Minister demanded one thing from his war industry: better tanks. In July 1940, even as the Battle of Britain raged overhead, a new specification was written: a 22 infantry tank. The idea was simple: design a tank that could cross trenches, climb cliffs, and survive any German gun known at the time. It was to be a fortress on tracks, a machine that could restore British pride and withstand the storm that had shattered France. The project was rushed. Engineers worked through air raids, drafting blueprints in shelters and factories lit by dim emergency lights. The first prototype rolled out in 1941. It was christened the Churchill, after the man whose defiance had become the spirit of Britain itself. The Churchill was not elegant. It was heavy, slow, and mechanically troublesome in its early versions, but it carried something different. Philosophy. It embodied endurance over speed, protection over agility while German tanks raced forward. The Churchill was designed to hold, to survive, to keep moving under fire when others could not. As the war expanded into North Africa and the Eastern Front, British industry struggled to produce enough of them. By 1942, newer models corrected its flaws: thicker armor, a better gun, improved suspension. Slowly, the laughter that had once echoed across German ranks began to fade. For when the Churchill finally met the enemy in battle, it would not break easily. And for the first time since 1940, British tank crews would fight with something that could truly stand toe-to-toe with the vaunted Panzer. The age of mockery was ending, and the age of respect was about to begin. For the men inside the Churchill, war was not theory. It was deafening, claustrophobic reality. Each tank crew was a five-man team bound by trust: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and co-driver. Inside, the air was thick with exhaust, cordite, and sweat. Communication was shouted through noise and vibration. Every gear change felt like a hammer blow. To outsiders, the tank seemed unstoppable, but inside, it was fragile life in a metal coffin. One shell hit could rip through the crew compartment. Fire was the greatest fear. It consumed oxygen faster than men could escape. Yet Churchill crews learned something remarkable. They could take punishment and live. Reports from Dieppe and Tunisia told of crews who crawled from burning Churchills after direct hits, saved by the sheer thickness of their armor. One veteran later wrote, "It felt like being inside a moving fortress, slow, but alive when everything else was dead." These men were not professional tank philosophers. They were miners, farmers, mechanics, men who had watched Europe fall and swore it would not happen again. Their machine was crude, but it gave them confidence that had been missing since Dunkirk. Each time they advanced, they carried the weight of that humiliation and the hope that this time, the steel would hold. In 1940, British tank tactics were still built on old habits. Armor and infantry fought separately. As if in different wars, commanders saw tanks as moving shields, not decisive weapons. But after the collapse in France, that thinking died. By 1942, British doctrine had evolved. Under fire, new armored divisions were reorganized to fight in coordination with artillery and air power, a belated echo of what the Germans had mastered 2 years earlier. The Churchill tank, despite its slowness, found its place in this new thinking as the spearhead of infantry assaults where toughness mattered more than speed. In North Africa, it proved its worth during the Second Battle of El Alamein. Churchills of the 51st Royal Tank Regiment faced German 88mm guns, the deadliest anti-tank weapons of the desert. Many Churchills were hit. Some burned, but others kept moving, drawing fire so that Shermans and Crusaders could flank the enemy. Commanders began to realize that resilience could win time, and time in battle was victory. The tank's role shifted from theory to adaptation. Britain had learned that no doctrine survives first contact. The Churchill's thick armor and trench-climbing tracks turned it into the assault tank of choice for rough ground and fortified positions. It became not a symbol of speed, but of stubbornness, a trait the British Army understood well. The Churchill's design was both a marvel and a headache conceived under wartime panic. It had flaws: weak engines, mechanical breakdowns, poor gun power in early models, but it also possessed unique strengths no other Allied tank could match. Its tracks ran almost the entire length of its body, allowing it to climb cliffs, cross deep ditches, and grind over terrain that stopped faster tanks cold. Its thick, vertical armor, up to 102 millimeters in later versions, made it one of the best protected vehicles in the war, and because its design allowed for internal space, it became a platform for constant innovation. Engineers could bolt on flamethrowers, bridge layers, mine flails, and engineering tools. By 1943, a new family of Churchill variants emerged, each designed for a specific problem on the battlefield. The Germans respected its engineering. Reports from the Eastern Front noted how the Churchill could survive hits that would destroy most Soviet tanks. Mechanics cursed it, crews loved it, generals began to see it as a symbol of British engineering's peculiar genius. Stubborn, overbuilt, and ultimately reliable. The same nation once mocked for its teapots on tracks was now producing a tank that even the enemy studied with caution. The Churchill was not built to win races, it was built to survive them. And survival was now Britain's strategy. Leadership shaped every bolt of the Churchill tank. Winston Churchill's return to power in 1940 was more than political, it was mechanical. The tank that bore his name was not his personal design, but it carried his philosophy, defiance through endurance. In 1940, as Britain stood alone against the Axis, Churchill demanded weapons that could fight on the beaches and hold ground no matter the cost. His directive to the Ministry of Supply was blunt: build a tank that could advance even under artillery fire, cross bomb craters, and resist every known German gun. It was an impossible order under bombardment and shortages, but his leadership, equal parts pressure and vision, made it happen. Engineers at Vauxhall Motors worked through nights as Luftwaffe bombs fell nearby. They finished the first prototype in a mere 10 months, an extraordinary feat when the first Churchills rolled out. Churchill himself inspected them, remarking that they looked British in every sense, thick-skinned and full of fight. Despite early flaws, he refused to abandon the project where others saw failure. He saw potential. His persistence saved the design from cancellation after mechanical breakdowns in 1941. Without his personal support, the tank might never have seen combat. Leadership in war is not only about speeches or strategies, it is about belief. Belief strong enough to drag imperfect steel into the fight. And in that, the Churchill tank mirrored the man. The Wehrmacht's first encounters with British tanks had been marked by ridicule. German officers mocked the squat shapes of the early cruisers and Matildas, seeing them as slow, outdated targets. Their confidence was grounded in experience. Their Panzers had crushed Poland, Belgium, and France with ease. But war has a way of humbling certainty. When German troops faced the Churchill in Tunisia in 1943, that confidence began to fracture. Reports from Panzer Grenadier units recorded shells bouncing harmlessly off the tank's frontal armor in one skirmish near Mejez el Bab. A Churchill advanced directly into anti-tank fire, took 6 hits, and kept moving. German crews called it der Stahlbunker, the steel bunker. At Kursk and on the Italian front, captured Churchills used by Soviet and Allied forces proved similarly resilient. The Germans noted that their 50 millimeters guns could barely scratch its surface. Only the dreaded 88 millimeters could reliably destroy it. And even then, the Churchill sometimes refused to die quickly. The laughter stopped not because the British had suddenly become faster or more numerous, but because they had become durable. For German soldiers, accustomed to quick victories, the sight of a tank that absorbed punishment and refused to stop was unsettling. It was a new kind of enemy, one that fought not with speed, but with stubborn endurance. In letters and after-action reports, German officers described the Churchill with a mix of frustration and admiration. What they had once dismissed as British clumsiness now looked like calculation. The enemy they mocked was learning. For Britain, the Churchill tank was more than metal, it was redemption. After Dunkirk, the British Army needed a symbol that could restore confidence, not just in its soldiers, but in its people. Cities were bombed nightly, the empire was stretched thin, morale was fragile. The Churchill embodied a national character that refused to yield. It was slow, scarred, and imperfect, yet it endured. It reflected the same spirit that held Londoners steady during the Blitz, that rebuilt cities while bombers still droned overhead. For the tank crews, it became personal. Many had lost comrades in France. They had watched Europe fall. Now they fought in a machine that could finally fight back. Each dented hull and scorched plate told a story of survival. When Churchill tanks supported Canadian and British infantry during the Dieppe raid in 1942, many were lost, bogged down in the shingle. Yet even that disaster carried lessons that led to the specialized Churchill Havre and Crocodile variants that would storm Normandy 2 years later. Out of failure came reinvention. The laughter of 1940 had turned into respect by 1944. And for a nation that had once stood alone, the Churchill tank became a rolling monument, proof that endurance could be a weapon too. The moral victory was not just in battlefields won, but in belief restored. The North African sun was cruel that spring. It baked the olive groves and dust-covered ridges of Tunisia into a brittle wasteland. German and Italian forces clung to the high ground near Mejez el Bab, controlling the passes that led toward Tunis, the final Axis stronghold in Africa. For months, Allied offensives had failed against these positions. Every attack ended in ruin. The hills were steep, mined, and watched by German 88mm guns. British infantry could not move an inch without being cut down. The enemy held the heights, and with them, the key to North Africa. Then came Longstop Hill, a jagged ridge rising above the Tunis plain. The Germans had fortified it with concrete bunkers, artillery nests, and machine gun webs. The terrain looked impossible for tanks. The slopes were narrow and stony, broken by gullies. Even veteran British officers doubted that any armored vehicle could climb it. But the Churchill was no ordinary tank. On the morning of April 22, 1943, the 48th Royal Tank Regiment moved into position under the command of Lieutenant Colonel P.H. Pip Roberts. Each Churchill carried a 5-man crew. Sweating in the heat, nerves tight, the plan was simple but audacious. The Churchills would advance directly up the slopes, side by side with infantry of the 1st Guards Brigade, clearing bunkers one by one. When the order came, the ground trembled. The Churchills crawled forward, engines growling, tracks biting into the earth. German observers, watching through binoculars, were stunned. Tanks were not supposed to climb those ridges, yet the Churchills kept coming, unstoppable. German 50mm and 75mm guns opened fire. Shells struck, sparks, clangs, smoke. The Churchills staggered, but did not stop. Their armor absorbed the punishment. Their guns replying with thunder, infantry followed in their wake, sheltered by the tank's massive hulls. One Churchill was hit 6 times, once on the turret, twice on the hull, 3 times on the track guards, but continued to fire until it reached the crest. Another was immobilized by a mine, yet its crew refused to abandon it. They turned the tank into a stationary bunker, covering the advance with precise bursts from its 6-pounder gun. The Germans, believing the tanks would falter, now faced an unthinkable sight. British armor grinding relentlessly up terrain they had considered invulnerable. By midday, the ridge was a cauldron of dust and flame. Infantry and Churchills fought side by side at point-blank range. The tanks crushed wire obstacles beneath their treads, their guns blasting pillboxes apart. Every time a Churchill was hit, another filled the gap. When dusk fell, Longstop Hill was in British hands. The Germans had withdrawn, leaving wrecked guns and burning half-tracks scattered across the slopes. The impossible had been done. That night, reports filtered through German lines describing the assault. English tanks climbing cliffs under fire, impervious to direct hits. Some commanders refused to believe it. Others warned that Britain, had finally found a tank equal to the Panzers. The victory at Longstop was not just tactical, it was psychological. It shattered the idea that British armor was inferior. It proved that the Churchill could do what no other tank could: survive the impossible, move through terrain that defied logic, and still fight. In the weeks that followed, the reputation of the Churchill spread like wildfire across the front crews who had once doubted their machines began to trust them. Infantry units requested Churchills by name for assaults on fortified positions, and in Berlin, the laughter that had once echoed in tank depots turned into quiet recalculation. A German field report from late April captured the change in tone. The English heavy tank presents extreme difficulty. Standard anti-tank weapons ineffective at normal range. Engagement must be at close quarters or avoided entirely. For the first time since 1940, the Germans were the ones adjusting their tactics, not the British. Longstop Hill was more than a hill. It was the grave of German complacency and the birthplace of British redemption. And as word reached London, Churchill himself reportedly smiled at the irony. The machine that bore his name had done precisely what he had promised his nation it would do: never give in. The victory at Longstop Hill was more than a single triumph. It was the turning of a tide. The Churchill tank had proven its worth. But wars are not won by symbols alone. They are won by endurance, by machines that continue to fight after the headlines fade. By mid-1943, the Allies had driven the Axis from North Africa. Attention shifted north, across the Mediterranean, toward Italy, and with that shift came new terrain, new challenges, and a new opportunity for the Churchill to show its unique strength. Italy, the mountain tank. Italy was a country of hills and ruins, a nightmare for tankers: steep slopes, narrow roads, and soft mud turned most armored vehicles into sitting targets. But for the Churchill, this was familiar ground. Its wide tracks, high torque, and climbing ability made it the perfect machine for the Italian campaign. At Ortona, Monte Cassino, and the Gothic Line, Churchill tanks hauled themselves up gradients no other Allied tank could manage. Their thick armor allowed them to press close to fortified positions, supporting infantry in brutal close combat. One report from the 51st Royal Tank Regiment during the assault on the Gustav Line reads, "The Churchills climbed a slope of 30 degrees under heavy fire, engaging gun positions point blank despite multiple hits. None were penetrated. German soldiers learned to recognize its shape and sound. The low rumble of the Churchill's Bedford engine became a warning. The British bunker was coming again." Even the Wehrmacht's most feared anti-tank weapons struggled. The 75mm guns that had ripped apart Crusaders and Shermans often failed to stop the Churchill unless they hit it perfect. Angles to the infantry it supported, it became not just a machine, but a shield, a moving wall between life and death. But before Italy and victory, there was Dieppe, a disaster that nearly killed the Churchill legend before it was born. In August 1942, nearly a year before Longstop Hill, Allied planners launched a raid on the French port of Dieppe. It was meant as a test for a future invasion of Europe. Churchill tanks, newly deployed, were sent ashore with Canadian forces to breach sea walls and destroy defenses. It went wrong from the start. The beach was made of loose shingle. The tanks bogged down almost immediately. Tracks spun uselessly in the gravel. Some became trapped behind sea walls under withering fire. Crews fought from stationary positions until they were destroyed or captured. None made it off the beach. German propaganda mocked the Churchills drowned at sea. Photos of burning tanks littered newspapers across Europe. Yet the raid, though costly, became a laboratory for learning. Engineers studied every failure: the shingle that stopped tracks, the lack of specialized equipment, the exposed infantry. Those lessons would later shape the D-Day invasion in 1944. From the wreckage of Dieppe rose a new generation of Churchill variants, tanks designed for every nightmare that beach warfare could bring. The Churchill Avery, Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers carried a 290mm spigot, mortar that could blast through concrete bunkers. The Churchill Crocodile replaced its hull machine gun with a flamethrower, projecting a stream of fire up to 120 yards. These strange, terrifying machines would be the spearhead of the greatest invasion in history. At dawn on June 6, 1944, Allied ships filled the English Channel. The D-Day landings had begun. Among the hundreds of tanks waiting aboard landing craft were dozens of Churchills, VREs, crocodiles, bridge layers, each customized for a single, brutal purpose: to make sure no man was trapped on the beaches like at Dieppe. As the first waves hit the Normandy coast, the Churchills came alive. Crocodiles burned out German pillboxes that had survived naval bombardment. AVREs demolished concrete bunkers with their enormous mortar. Bridge-laying Churchills unfolded metal spans under fire, allowing infantry and other tanks to cross flooded ditches. German defenders, veterans of years of occupation, had expected panic instead. They watched in disbelief as these thick-skinned monsters clawed their way inland through mines, barbed wire, and shell craters. A captured German soldier later recalled, "We fired at them again and again. The shells bounced. Then came the fire, real fire. We ran." By the end of June, the British and Canadians had broken through the Atlantic Wall in multiple sectors. The very tank that had been mocked in 1940 now led the liberation of Europe. The Churchill's finest hour was not its fastest battle or its deadliest. It was its consistency, its refusal to fail when others might have. It climbed the hills of Italy, crushed the bunkers of Normandy, and bore the scars of every continent the war touched. It was at last everything its name promised: unyielding. And for the first time since 1939, British armor was no longer a subject of German laughter, but of German caution, even fear. The Churchill had rewritten the rulebook. The enemy who once sneered now respected, and the soldiers who once doubted now believed. By the summer of 1944, the laughter had stopped completely. Every German division facing the British Army in Normandy knew the name Churchill. In after-action reports of the 12th SS Panzer Division, commanders noted with frustration that British infantry advance under direct tank cover, using heavy Churchills impervious to our lighter guns. What had once been derided as a mechanical curiosity was now treated with tactical respect, even dread. The numbers tell the story. Between 1941 and 1945, over 5,600 Churchill tanks rolled out of British factories. Each new Mark refined lessons learned on the battlefield. The Mark IV's welded armor, the Mark VI's 75mm gun, the Mark VII's massive 152mm of frontal protection. By late 1944, the Churchill VII could shrug off hits that would have torn through early Shermans or Cromwells. It was no longer a compromise between protection and mobility. It was an engineering statement: survival first. Yet for all its technical evolution, the real transformation happened within the British Army itself. 4 years earlier, British crews had fought in outdated designs. Their confidence shattered in France by 1945. Morale had reversed. Infantry now asked specifically for Churchill support during assaults. Its reliability in mud, rubble, and snow became a psychological anchor. Soldiers knew that when the Churchill moved, the line would hold. The tank also redefined Allied cooperation in Normandy's bocage, and later in the Netherlands. Canadian, Polish, and British units coordinated with Churchill squadrons as if with living fortresses. The Crocodile's terrifying flamethrower broke German resistance in Cannes suburbs. The VRE's flying dustbin mortar cleared fortified crossings over the Siegfried Line. Allied field commanders compared the pairing of infantry and Churchill tanks to a walking barrage. The enemy called it something else: fewer Panzer, the fire tank. Behind the front, reports from intelligence officers began to notice subtler shift: the German myth of technological superiority. The idea that the Panzer IV and Tiger ruled unchallenged was cracking in October 1944. An intercepted radio transmission from a German armor unit near Nijmegen read, "Churchill types difficult to destroy, except at close range. Recommend use of 88mm only." Those words carried an unspoken admission. The Allies had achieved parity. In Britain, the success of the Churchill breathed new life into a strained industry. Vauxhall's factories in Luton worked around the clock, streamlining designs while training mechanics for field repairs. The Ministry of Supply began developing future heavy tanks, the Black Prince, the Conqueror, direct descendants of the Churchill philosophy: armor before elegance, endurance before speed. But victory always comes with a cost. By the time British armor reached the Rhine in early 1945, hundreds of Churchills lay wrecked across 2 continents. Some had been gutted by mines, others immobilized by terrain too rough, even for their sturdy tracks. Crews had fought from Sicily to the Ardennes, often inside the same steel hulls for years. Tank regiments recorded attrition rates as high as 40% during continuous operations. Still, the statistics reveal something remarkable. The Churchill's crew survival rate was among the highest of any Allied tank. Its interior space, armor slope, and fireproof bulkheads gave men a chance to live through direct hits that would have incinerated them in lighter machines. Veterans would later say, "You trusted the Churchill because it trusted you back." As the Allies closed in on Germany, the Churchill took part in the final pushes across the Rhine and into the Ruhr in one of its last major actions. At Ries in March 1945, a squadron of Churchills provided direct fire under heavy artillery, blasting through reinforced buildings so infantry could clear the town street by street. By April, these same tanks rolled through shattered villages that 4 years earlier had mocked British armor. Every dented plate, every soot-stained turret told the same story. The ridicule of 1940 had been repaid in full. From the ashes of humiliation, the Churchill had forged Britain's redemption in steel. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the guns quieted. But the Churchill's engines did not across Europe. Hundreds of the massive tanks still clanked through ruined cities, not as weapons now, but as peacekeepers. They cleared rubble from Dutch towns, dragged bridges across bombed rivers, and served as mobile generators for rebuilding crews. The same armor that had once sheltered men from fire now shielded them from falling masonry. Britain, exhausted and nearly bankrupt, began dismantling its vast war machine. Shermans and Cromwells were sold or scrapped in bulk. Yet the Churchill remained its reliability. Even after years of combat, made it invaluable during the uncertain first years of peace. By 1946, entire squadrons were redesignated as Churchill Armored Engineer Regiments, assigned to British occupation zones in Germany. Meanwhile, military engineers studied the lessons its design had burned into the steel. They found that the Churchill's heavy armor and side-mounted suspension gave exceptional climbing ability, perfect for rough terrain. Though at a cost in speed, those principles influenced every major British tank that followed: the Centurion, the Conqueror, even the Chieftain of the Cold War era. Each carried echoes of that same philosophy: protection first, crew survival paramount. Foreign observers noticed 2 Soviet and American delegations examined captured Churchills after the war. Comparing them to their own designs, the Soviets admired the hull's internal reinforcement. Though they preferred the sloped style of their T-34s, the Americans learned from its mechanical reliability and crew ergonomics in subtle ways. The Churchill helped shape the post-war doctrine of armored warfare across both East and West. But its most lasting legacy wasn't on blueprints. It was in memory. For the men who served inside, the Churchill was more than a machine. It was a companion that endured the unendurable. Veterans remembered the smell of cordite trapped inside its turret, the rattle of loose shell casings underfoot, The heat from the engine that thawed frozen hands in winter. Many spoke of the strange comfort of its thick walls, how the clang of enemy shells striking the armor became, perversely, a sign of safety. In 1948, when the first post-war British Army reunion for Churchill crews was held in London, former gunners and drivers came from as far as Canada and India. On the stage stood an actual Churchill Mark 7. Its hull scarred and patched, the audience rose in silence as a bugler played the last post. A simple plaque read, "For those who rode within and did not return, outside." A new war was already brewing, not of trenches and tanks, but of ideology and fear as the Cold War dawned. Britain once again prepared for the possibility of armored conflict. The Churchill, though aging, was not done yet. Upgraded variants, the Churchill Crocodile and a VRE, saw combat once more in Korea, 1950 to 1953, on the frozen hills near the Imjin River. The old steel beasts climbed slopes that even American Pershings avoided. Reports from British units noted the same reliability that had defined it a decade earlier. By the mid-1950s, newer tanks replaced it, and the Churchill finally retired. Many were scrapped, but some were preserved, monuments in villages once liberated under its guns. One still stands at Longstop Hill in Tunisia. Its tracks have sunk in the soil, a silent witness to the battle that proved its worth. For historians, the Churchill represents more than a technical achievement. It marks a moral recovery. A nation that began the war mocked and ended it respected for soldiers. It stands for trust, a machine that did exactly what it promised, no more, no less. The German soldiers who once laughed at the British teapots on tracks learned to respect them the hard way. And in that respect lay the quiet victory of the British Tank Corps, a vindication, written not in boast or propaganda, but in the deep gouges along the Churchill steel skin. When peace finally settled over Europe, those scars caught the sunlight, reminders of the long road from ridicule to redemption. History often remembers war through its victors, its generals, or its weapons. But the story of the Churchill tank is not one of domination, it is one of endurance. When it first appeared, it was slow, awkward, and underestimated. It was born in a moment of desperation. When Britain had lost nearly everything on the fields of France, the men who climbed into its cold steel shell were not chasing glory. They were fighting to rebuild belief that courage could outlast mockery, that failure could forge strength. Every dent on its armor told that story. From the mud of Dieppe to the smoke of Longstop Hill, from the ruins of Cassino to the hedgerows of Normandy, the Churchill carried its crew through every kind of hell and somehow kept moving. It became a paradox in motion, a slow tank that always arrived when it mattered most. It was not the most powerful tank of the war, it was not the fastest, but it was the most human. Its value lay not in what it destroyed, but in what it protected, the men inside, the infantry behind, and the fragile idea that resilience can triumph over ridicule. In the end, that was the Churchill's true victory. It turned humiliation into respect, and laughter into silence. It stood as proof that strength is not born from perfection, but from persistence, from refusing to break when the world expects you to. Today, the surviving Churchills rest quietly in museums and fields. Their engines cold, their paint faded, but for those who remember, the echo remains, the deep, heavy rumble of a machine that refused to die before its duty was done. In that echo lives a truth larger than war itself. Sometimes, history's greatest power is not in speed or fire, but in the stubborn courage to keep moving forward.